we have, as you know, in this country, a very large expenditure of governmental funds on higher education in the form of state universities, which are financed out of state or maybe city or local groups, also in the form of federal subsidies to higher education, directly to the institutions, and indirectly to students in the form of subsidized loans of various kinds, grants, also grants without condition. And the question I want to raise is whether those higher education expenditures are a justifiable activity of government and what their consequences are, whether they really are a desirable element of a welfare state. I may say my own view has always been very simply that they are not, the reason being that in the main the benefits go to the individuals who get the higher schooling, the students on the one hand, that those students tend to be in the middle or upper income groups. Either their parents are from that group or they themselves will be in that group when they get out, whereas the funds come from people all over, so that you have a case in which you are imposing taxes on relatively low-income people to confer very large benefits on upper-income people.
I agree that I think the subsidies are regressive and that the wrong people are paying for it. On the other hand, I think there are some sectors of the world which economics should stay out of and which private interests should stay out of. And I think education is one. I think as soon as you start offering people economic incentives to get educated or to use the education that they get for economic means, in other words, once you put a price tag on knowledge, I think you're going to be
What are you talking about? You mean to say that the graduates of colleges and universities don't use their capacities in the direction which is influenced by the incomes they can earn?
Not completely, no.
Oh, but neither do the people who don't go to college. Nobody is completely dominated by the highest income. So in what respect, in what way do you think that governmental financing of higher education in any way changes the incentives to which the individuals who get the education react?
Well, it's hard to talk about this without having the possibilities before us. Let me tell you, one possibility I've heard is that people would, in effect, invest in me. If I went to college, somebody would say, he's probably going to do well, so we'll pay him to go to college, and then as he makes money, he'll pay us back. And it's a good investment. That gives, first of all, they're going to judge people not on how well they get educated, but how well they're going to do after college. So right there, I think that's a subversion of the educational process.
Let's stop for a moment.
Okay.
You think that the grantors of government higher education are judging the expenditure of that education by how good the education is? How do you explain the fact that the most eminent universities, disproportionately contributing to the Nobel laureates or other marks, are the non-governmental as opposed to the governmental institutions?
Well, I think private institutions are, in general, better, though certainly there are very good state institutions.
Well, I feel that there's a basic assumption that has to be challenged, and that's that the students by themselves benefit. If you believe that society places education as a goal worthy of attainment, and that by having a more educated society, society will benefit, then I feel that no one is losing out by having an individual going to a university and becoming a professional.
Let me ask you a question. Did society benefit from the development of the microcomputer industry in Silicon Valley?
I feel that every step taken forward, society does benefit from.
Did society benefit from that?
I'm not familiar with that one example.
Well, did society benefit from Henry Ford's introduction of the Model T Ford?
Yes, I think it did.
Should the society therefore have subsidized Henry Ford to produce a Model T?
Subsidy, see, that issue is not really relevant to the issue at hand.
This is a subsidy.
But if you use the example of education, sticking with higher education, the assumption has been made that there are a group of people who are giving and are not receiving in return. I think that is false, because although there are a group of individuals who are poor, and they may be taxed, and these taxes go towards financing someone's education, they are not losing out, because society is benefited by having a core of people who indeed do attain education.
Excuse me, that's my whole point. Society was benefited by Henry Ford's producing it. The poor people you're talking about benefited by Henry Ford's doing it. And yet you do not believe that government should have used compulsory taxation to generate that benefit. Where's the difference?
if it had to get the Henry Ford's achievements, if it had to get to
In
federally
those
fund that,
states,
then I think, yeah, sure, it
well,
should
let's go back. Let's look at the evidence.
Okay.
If you look at collectivist states like Russia, China, they are states which use the same means for getting the Henry Fords that they use to finance higher education. And what kind of Henry Fords do they get? But I want to stick to this component of the welfare state, higher education. How do you justify using tax funds? Do you suppose, let's suppose you did not have any tax funds. Would there be institutions of higher education?
Yes, there would be, but you would have a different brand of people going there.
How do you know?
The ones who would benefit would be those who are wealthy and can afford it. As it stands now, in America,
you
which is
sure
the
of
greatest
that?
thing about America, in my mind, you can go to a college and go to an institution of higher learning without having to worry about finances because there are means available.
You
there
are
for
a very young man, Gary. Historically in the United States, people of every income class have been able to get through college and universities, whatever the income of their parents. Now,
Are you saying there's equal access?
no, I didn't say there's equal
Okay.
access. There are many respects in which people are not equal. And this is no different from others. The opportunity for a person to set up in a business is not independent of the wealth of his parents. It doesn't follow from that the government ought to set everybody up in business. What I'm trying to argue is that, as a matter of fact, historically, it has been possible. I speak personally. I come from a family, my parents never had an income which would have qualified for the poverty level by modern standards. And I've worked my way through college, and hundreds and thousands and millions of other people did the same thing. The question is, if you want to go to college, who should pay for it? You or somebody who isn't going to go to college?
It is in the best interest of every black individual, regardless of his station in life, to make sure that more blacks go to college and become professionals. Therefore, by using your logic, you would say by that one black person living in Harlem who does not have the funds available, he should not be made to give $1 of his paycheck to go to a person who's going to college.
The right word is made. There have long been black colleges and universities supported in large part by contributions from the black community. That's a voluntary activity. The question at issue is whether it is appropriate to make them contribute.
I think it is appropriate because that's something which I and a lot of other people deem as being very important.
Excuse me, for a moment, let's suppose you didn't go to a college. You would have conducted some other career. You might have made even more money in that other career.
I may not be as influential. That's the key.
But you might have made more money in that. You might have had more funds to put back. You might have been more influential.
Oh.
The question is, why should I subsidize you in going to college, but not subsidize you for a moment in setting up a business?
As I stated, it depends on the goal of society.
Society doesn't have goals. People have goals.
Well, people
you
make
have
up society.
common goals, of course. But insofar as their goals are common, they can do it through voluntary contributions.
Why should factory workers, or why should a poor black factory worker have to work an extra hour a week in order to send any of us to college?
Well, there's good and bad points to everything, but just because others get on the bandwagon and also benefit does not mean that we should not allow those who are on the lowest strata to
It's not
benefit.
just others, it's most of the people who go to college are middle class.
There is
or
no
wealthy.
governmental program in the country which so clearly takes money from low-income groups and gives it to high-income groups.
But you're making the assumption that you have a group of people who are in lower classes paying for the higher echelon. Well, the higher echelon doesn't really have to get the money to go to school.
I beg your pardon. Doesn't have to, of course.
They
But
have
it
other
does,
means.
But it does.
But they're
If I
not
take the
paid.
people who are going to Berkeley, here in California, the University of California, that's a state university, it doesn't have any tuition, it does have some fees. If you look at the average income of the parents of the people who are going there, this was done some time ago in all the state universities in California, 50% of the students came from the upper 25% of the income class, and 5% of the students came from the bottom 25% of it.
Well, if that's the current state of affairs, then that is not fair. But that does not mean we should scrap the whole institution of government subsidizing
Well,
education.
you tell me how you would arrange the subsidies.
Well, I don't have any easy answers, but I still wouldn't say scrap the whole system. And I think that's where we differ.
It
It
seems to
so
me-
happens that the oldest form of government subsidization of education was for higher education. And it is inherent in higher education that it will, in fact, be regressive. But now, look, here you are defending, two of you at least, defending the welfare state payments to students going to institutions of higher education. Do you feel the same way about welfare for business?
I think if we can't get a great car through private industry, and it's, if getting a good car is a good in itself, which it is, then we should federally fund it. Yeah.
And how are you going to, who is going to decide, and how are you going to decide whether government is more effective in doing that than private in the market itself?
It's not a question of who's more effective. I think I would agree that, especially in getting a good car, the private is always more effective. But we're taking a hypothetical case where the private market won't do it.
Well, let's not take hypothetical cases.
Okay.
Let's take real cases, for example. Here's the Chrysler Corporation.
Right.
The government, in effect, bailed it out by guaranteeing it a loan. Should the government have guaranteed that loan?
And not on principle. I really can't defend it on principle. But the fact is that a tremendous amount of our population is reliant on the auto industry and on Chrysler in particular.
What would have happened if Chrysler had gone bankrupt?
I don't know.
Would have continued to operate. But it would have operated under a receiver. The people who would have been hurt would have been the people who owned Chrysler shares or who had loaned money to Chrysler. In fact, the odds are that the properties would have been taken over by more efficient automobile producers, and for all I know, you would have had more jobs for all. Now, the question is, that's why I say this is welfare. The Chrysler loan is a form of welfare to the people who own stock and bonds, just as government subsidies to higher education is a form of welfare for the students who are in higher education.
Nobody would argue that what we did to Chrysler we should do for every folding firm. But I think government does have an opportunity to provide security. It's not fair to a Chrysler employee that he gets laid off and he gets impoverished because Lee Iacocca or somebody on the top of Chrysler made a mistake. So the government has the opportunity to offer him some security. And that's basically what we go to government for security.
But the government does provide a lot of that security by providing unemployment insurance, by providing all sorts of assistance for people who are put out of work.
So
the only question at stake here is whether he is in addition entitled to a job which brings in much more pay than the average American makes, producing products which nobody wants for the benefit of a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Again, you're switching it to industries that won't bounce back. In this case, we had an optimum use of security. He became secure, and at the same time, he got to work and contribute.
I don't see how we can know that it was optimum because we don't know what would have happened with that plant if it had been broken up and divided under new management. It might be that other people in Lee Iacocca could have managed that plant much more effectively. And maybe the workers who would have been working for that management would be better off today than if they had stayed, you know, under Iacocca's management. In any event, I just don't see why the government should be supporting Lee Iacocca any more than it should be supporting, you know, middle-class college students.